we have a pet peeve around the way some people use unplugged activities. Now, it's not that there's a problem with all unplugged activities. It's great to do some physical world activities and there can be value in it. And we do some of them. But too often, unplugged activities are used in a way to focus only on the concept and not on the making of things. Now, of course, in some places, it's argued you don't have access to the technology. There can be good reasons for doing it. And also there can be unplugged activities which do involve creating and making. So I can imagine some things without the technology where you're creating and making and learning some things. But I think the reason some people find it appealing because it can focus in on just learning the concepts without all that clutter of dealing with the problems of making things. But in my mind, the clutter is what's important, and that the activity of creating, reflecting on your creation, modifying your creation is where you make a deeper connection to the concepts.
Yeah, I feel the same way, honestly, about how a lot of people describe computational thinking. It's without application of that understanding. Okay, you learn decomposition, but why? Okay, you learn pattern recognition, but what are you going to use it for? How are you going to create? How are you going to model?
Yeah, and even the phrase computational thinking, again, it's hard to argue with. There's clearly important ideas, and we highlight some of those ideas of computational thinking. But the problem is if it's focused only on the thinking part without the creating part. So we'll often focus that we're interested in computational thinking in the context of computational fluency. When we say fluency, it means being able to create things and express yourself with the technology. And when you're able to express yourself, you do learn those important computational thinking concepts and computational thinking skills, but in the context of learning to express yourself. We often make the analogy with learning to write. And we've been inspired by some of the approaches of educators who come up with ways of supporting young people learning to write by expressing themselves, and try to have an alternative to the way that in too many places, kids learn to write by focusing on spelling, punctuation, and grammar. It's not that spelling, punctuation, and grammar are bad. It's good things to learn. But if you only focus on spelling, punctuation, and grammar, you're not going to fall in love with writing.
Yep.
So we're inspired by places that have focused on learning to write by telling stories. And once you tell stories, you want to learn spelling so that people will understand your stories that you write. But the focus should be on telling the stories and learning how to share your ideas. And we think the same with coding, that sometimes a lot of approaches to coding focus too much on the grammar, punctuation, and spelling side of coding. You'll learn some things there, and you might learn some concepts there, and you might learn some of those computational thinking concepts. But for us, it's both going to be more successful and most meaningful for kids if it's done in the context of the equivalent of telling stories is creating your own, interactive stories, games, animations on the computer.
Yeah, that parallel with writing definitely resonates with me. Having all my degrees in music education, I've gone through 8 semesters of music theory classes, and it's spending 8 semesters of analyzing music and basically looking at the grammar and punctuation, but never creating your own music. And it's so decontextualized that I ended up hating it. I had no joy in taking those classes. But if you were to ask me to write music on my own, yeah, I'd love to do that. I wish I had actual composition classes and whatnot. And so I'm afraid that CT and even CS might head in that direction where it's we're learning these concepts without applying it in some kind of creative or expressive way.
Totally agree. And it's important to emphasize to people just by focusing on the joy and the expression doesn't mean learning the technique is unimportant, because in order to really be able to express yourself, you will need to learn that technique.
Yep.
But you should do it in the context of expressing.
This excerpt of the CSK8 podcast is from episode number 106, which is titled Lifelong Kindergarten with Mitch Resnick.